A lot of times people will say, well, what's the common name? And unfortunately, Sericea is the common name. To tell these two plants apart, I like to hold the leaves up to the sunlight. You wouldn't want to respray thinking that you didn't get good control the first go. I'm standing here with Slender Lespedeza, Lespedeza virginica. Part of the reason that it has the name slender is that the whole plant stays fairly unbranched as it grows up. It does have some branches, but they stay fairly short, and so the plant stays pretty slim. And so you can see the ones here in front of me. There's not a lot of branching on them. That is a key characteristic for telling it apart from Sericea Lespedeza, which is the invasive species that grows here in Oklahoma. This is a legume, and it has compound leaves, which means that the leaf is divided into leaflets. It's divided into 3, but when we pull off these leaflets, we can actually look at the veins on the leaves to help to tell it apart from Sericea Lespedeza. That is one of the most simple ways to tell these two plants apart. I like to hold the leaves up to the sunlight so I can actually see through the leaf and see the veins really easily. You might have to put on your reading glasses to do that. But what happens on the leaf veins on Slender Lespedeza is that they actually branch. We call that netted veins, especially towards the very edges or the margins of the leaves. And that is one of the best characteristics that I know of to tell Slender Lespedeza from Sericea Lespedeza. On Sericea Lespedeza, the leaf veins actually go straight out to the edge, kind of like a feather with no branching. A lot of people bring up the flower color. Generally with Slender Lespedeza, the flowers do tend to be more of a purplish pink. And with Sericea Lespedeza, we tend to have more of a white flower with a pink center. But that's not always consistent. And so we want to use other characteristics to help us with identification. One of the reasons that you might want to be able to tell Slender Lespedeza from Sericea Lespedeza is if you live in a state where there's laws about controlling Sericea Lespedeza. We call those noxious plants when there's laws that you have to control that plant if it grows on your property. In Oklahoma, Sericea Lespedeza is not a noxious plant, but it is invasive. It can create these monocultures or just stands of only Sericea Lespedeza, which is not ideal for cattle and for wildlife. Slender Lespedeza is going to grow in a clump about this size. So typically we don't get a lot of Slender Lespedeza taking over a huge area. We'll just get these clumps of it where you've got quite a few different individuals growing there. It's a perennial plant, so if it comes up in one spot one year, you're going to find it in that same spot the next year. And it is a fantastic wildlife plant. The seeds are readily eaten by all sorts of songbirds, small mammals, game birds, turkey, quail, dove. The foliage is consumed by white-tailed deer. Cattle actually really prefer Slender Lespedeza, so if you're in a pasture with heavy grazing, this plant will decrease in that pasture, and sometimes they can even graze it out. It's really a plant that we do want to keep. Sometimes when we use a herbicide to control Sericea Lespedeza, what replaces it is Slender Lespedeza. It's filling this ecological niche, a legume replacing a legume. And that's fantastic. But if you don't know the difference between the two plants, you might think that your herbicide control did not work, and that it didn't kill the Sericea, when in actuality it was just replaced by the native Slender Lespedeza. So being able to tell those apart can be really important. You wouldn't want to respray thinking that you didn't get good control the first go. So here's an example of Sericea Lespedeza, Lespedeza cuneata. A lot of times people will say, well, what's the common name? And unfortunately, Sericea is the common name. This plant has much longer branches coming off of the main stem. So a lot of times you'll have the long stem coming up. When the plant is small, it'll have fairly short branches. As it matures, it starts to get these longer branches. Then it's much easier to tell apart from the slender. Again, I really do like the characteristic of looking at the veins on the leaves to just validate for sure that it is a Sericea Lespedeza that I'm looking at. This plant is invasive. It was planted for erosion control. At one point, folks thought that it was a really good wildlife plant. When they did end up trying to feed it to penned quail, they found that the quail actually couldn't break down the seed coat. Unfortunately, the seed coat on this legume is very, very thick, and it takes a long time to break down. So we don't prefer this plant for a wildlife food plant. It is consumed to some degree by cattle when it is young or when the plant has been burned and is regrowing. And so that's one way that we have used to control this plant, to get cattle to consume it a bit more using burning. When we're talking about identification, we have a legume. The leaves are divided into 3 little leaflets. Again, I use the veins. The veins go all the way straight to the very edge of that leaf. And so they look like a feather as far as the vein structure. This one is going to have more of a whitish flower in general, but again, I don't like the flower color for my final, for sure this is a Sericea Lespedeza. In some states, this is a noxious plant. The reason is that it makes these stands where only that plant is really filling in that area. So you'll have very few grasses, very few broadleaf plants growing in an area that has very, very dense Sericea Lespedeza. This is a plant that we have lots of different ways to control. We can use herbicide. We really prefer late season metsulfuron methyl herbicide applications. Late August or September, that time of year has very little impact on many of our native broadleaf plants that those herbicides could otherwise negatively impact. So another native Lespedeza that we have is called Roundhead Lespedeza. This is Lespedeza capitata. This plant generally has much larger leaflets. So again, it's a legume. It has 3 leaflets and they usually have a whitish cast because there's a little bit of hair or fuzz on those leaflet surface. Another characteristic about this plant is the very distinctive seed heads. The flower clusters on Roundhead Lespedeza is what gives it its name. So even in the winter, you can tell Roundhead Lespedeza by the cluster where the flower was at the very, very tip of the plant. Here I actually have one from last year. Grew last year, was fertilized, and you can see that clump that's still left the year after. The other thing about this plant is the narrow structure. So similar to Slender Lespedeza, you don't generally have very long branches in the plant of a Roundhead Lespedeza. It's going to look more like a Slender Lespedeza than a Sericea Lespedeza, but the leaflets are generally much larger, and this plant looks fairly different from the other 2 Lespedezas that I mentioned today. So I have a couple of Roundhead Lespedezas right here next to me. You're never going to see a huge area that's just covered in Roundhead Lespedeza. They don't generally grow in a monotypic stand or a stand of just Roundhead Lespedeza, and because of their narrow structure like a Slender Lespedeza, they don't crowd out many of our other native plants similar to what a Sericea does. Roundhead Lespedeza is another plant that lots of wildlife and even livestock like to consume. The leaves are very palatable for white-tailed deer, for cattle. This plant can sometimes be grazed out because of their preference for it. In addition to that, the flowers are used by lots of different pollinators, and the seeds are readily eaten, again, by turkey, by songbirds, quail, dove. Lots of different animals like to eat the seeds that fall off of a Roundhead Lespedeza.